Bath received some excellent news last week. Plans have been approved for the UK's first Frankenstein Museum to be located in Gay Street in a period townhouse near to the Jane Austen Centre. Why a Frankenstein Museum in Bath? Well, it's a little known fact that Mary Shelley wrote a substantial part of the novel during a 6-month stay here. It's fair to claim that Frankenstein is the most celebrated book to be written in Bath. Now, one of the backers of this new project stated in a recent news release, Frankenstein was effectively the first sci-fi novel. It's in the top 100 most influential books of all time, but no one in Bath mentions it. Well, I do, and there's actually a plaque commemorating the site of the house where Mary Shelley stayed, and there is also a brilliant Frankenstein walking tour by the Show of Strength Theatre Company. Now, it's slightly ironic that this museum is going to be located near the Jane Austen Centre. Austen, two of Austen's novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, are set in Bath, but she didn't write those novels while she was living here. In fact, for the 5 years she lived in Bath, she hardly wrote a thing. Dickens wrote about Bath, but from a distance. Sheridan's The Rivals was written after he'd lived in the city. So for a city that likes to trumpet its literary associations, it'll be wonderful to have a museum which celebrates a book, most of which was actually written in Bath. Mary Shelley had extraordinary parents and an extraordinary upbringing. Her mother, of course, was Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and her father was William Godwin, also a political philosopher. Now, Mary's mother died 11 days after the birth, and her father remarried 4 years later, giving Mary a rather complicated set of siblings. She had an older half-sister, Fanny Imlay, whose father was Gilbert Imlay, the American diplomat, writer and entrepreneur who had met Mary Wollstonecraft in Paris during the French Revolution. She now has 2 step-siblings, one of whom, Claire Clairmont, becomes important for our story. And then 4 years later, she acquires another half-brother, William. Now, essentially, Mary Shelley was homeschooled. Her future husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, went to Eton College and University College, Oxford, as all ASC alums know, but Mary had no such options. She was tutored mainly by her father in a broad range of subjects and had the run of his extensive library. At the age of 15, he made these comments about Mary. She's singularly bold, somewhat imperious and active of mind. Her desire of knowledge is great, and her perseverance in everything she undertakes almost invincible. Well, I've written a lot of school reports in my time, but I would have been quite proud of that one. Now, Mary first met Shelley when she was 16 and he was 21. He was already married and had a baby daughter. Shelley was a friend of William Godwin's and a follower of his radical political views. Now, it's said that Shelley and Mary used to meet secretly by her mother's grave in St Pancras churchyard. Certainly William Godwin did not approve of the relationship. Whilst he advocated anarchism and free love in theory, his attitude to his family was somewhat more conventional. So Shelley and Mary decided to elope in July 1814, taking Claire Clairmont with them, but leaving Shelley's pregnant wife behind. So off they went to France and into Switzerland, and then when the money ran out, they returned to London. Mary was now pregnant with Shelley's child. Her father disowned her and cut her off financially. Later that year, Shelley's wife gave birth to a son, and in February 1815, Mary gave birth prematurely, but the baby died. A year later, in July 1816, Shelley and Mary decided to go on their travels again. Shelley's finances had improved after the death of his grandfather. So the party consisted of Shelley, Mary, and their 6-month-old son, William, known as Wilmouse, plus Claire Clairmont, who was pregnant after a recent affair with Lord Byron. So they head off to Lake Geneva to meet up with Byron, who has rented rather a grand villa, the Villa Diodati. The Shelley family are staying in a rather more humble chalet down by the lake. The weather was terrible. This was the year without a summer. The year before, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted, sending huge amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, obscuring the sun, so that temperatures dropped. There was torrential rainfall, the harvests failed, there was a sense of unease and impending doom. Now, the Shelley party used to spend their evenings at Byron's villa, and if the weather was really terrible, they used to stay overnight. So it must have been a bit like being in lockdown. And there are so many games of Monopoly that you can play. So when Lord Byron suggested a ghost story challenge, everybody thought that would help to pass on an hour. Now, there had been discussions about Galvanism and the principles of animation. Luigi Galvani had conducted experiments using electricity to try and reanimate dead frogs. So no doubt these discussions were in Mary's mind when she went to bed that evening. And she saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing that he had put together. I have found it. What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the spectre that haunted my midnight pillow. The party decided to leave about a month later, and Frankenstein at this point was just really a very rough draft. The Shelley party headed back to England, but decided not to go to London. They were rather anxious to avoid William Godwin, who would have been very angry about Claire Clairmont's pregnancy and was still unhappy about the relationship between Mary and Shelley. The Shelley party decided to come to Bath until Claire Clairmont had her baby. They were here for nearly 6 months, and what a tempestuous 6 months they turned out to be. They took lodgings in Five Abbey Churchyard, in rooms above a circulating library. The house was demolished in the late 19th century to make way for a concert room next to the pump room, and that concert room is now the ticket hall of the Roman Baths. Now, Mary was determined not to waste her time while she was waiting for Claire Clairmont to have her baby, and so she worked hard at her Frankenstein manuscript. She went to drawing lessons twice a week. She studied Latin. She went to lectures given by a Dr. Wilkinson in the Kingston Lecture Room, just around the corner from where she was living. Now, Dr. Wilkinson, like Dr. Galvani, believed in the possibility of electricity animating or reanimating lifeless matter. And surely those lectures helped to fuel Mary's ideas as she was writing Frankenstein, and almost certainly made the physical detailed descriptions of the laboratories in which the creature was put together more convincing. Now, 2 family tragedies descended on Mary and Shelley later in their stay in Bath. Fanny Imlay had lost her teaching job as a result of Mary eloping with Shelley, and she was depressed about being financially dependent on her stepfather. Most biographers also agree that she was in love with Shelley. In October, Shelley received a letter from Fanny, which was written from Bristol, that was a concern, and so he set off for Bristol, only to find that she had left for some unknown destination. A few days later, news arrived in Bath that Fanny had taken an overdose of laudanum in an inn in Swansea. William Godwin, her stepfather, hushed up the whole affair, and Fanny was buried in an unmarked grave. In December, there was further tragedy. Harriet, Shelley's wife, walked into the Serpentine in Hyde Park in London with stones in her pockets and drowned. She was heavily pregnant and the father was unknown. Shelley went up to London in the attempt to get custody of his 2 children by Harriet, but Harriet's family were not happy with that request. And so Shelley's lawyers advised him if he married Mary, that would help his case. And he married Mary on the 30th of December, 1816. That helped to heal the rift between Mary and her father, but it didn't impress the Court of Chancery that gave custody to foster parents rather than to Shelley, who was considered to be an unfit parent. Meanwhile, back in Bath, Claire Clairmont gave birth to a daughter on the 12th of January 1817, and she named the girl Alba. This was overruled by Lord Byron, who insisted the girl should be called Allegra. In late February, the Shelleys left Bath to move to Marlow in Buckinghamshire, where Mary soon finished A Frankenstein. She had her third child, Clara, in September of that year. And then on New Year's Day, 1818, Frankenstein was published anonymously in a 3-volume edition of 500 copies. Everybody assumed that Shelley was the author. Nobody predicted its success. Soon after the publication of Frankenstein, the Shelleys set off for Italy. The party consisted of Mary Shelley and their 2 children, Will Mouse and Clara, and Claire Clairmont and her baby daughter Allegra. They were summoned to Venice by Lord Byron, who had decreed that he would look after Allegra as long as Claire Clairmont had nothing more to do with her. In fact, Byron soon tired of his parental responsibilities, placed Allegra in a convent where she died of typhus at the age of 5. Meanwhile, Mary and her 2 children were being dragged around Italy on the whims of Shelley. Partly as a result of this unsettled nomadic existence, their 2 children died. Clara in Venice after a period of strenuous coach travel, and the beloved Will Mouse, aged 4, in Rome of malaria. Mary was deeply in grief, and she was also having to cope with the knowledge that Shelley and Claire Clairmont were deeply attached emotionally and almost certainly were lovers. In November 1819, Mary had her 4th child, Percy Florence Shelley, who was her only child to survive into adulthood. By the summer of 1822, they were in a house in San Terenzo, just south of La Spezia on the west coast of Italy. I happened to come across that house on holiday last year, and it was from here that Shelley took his last ill-fated sailing trip. He was drowned in a storm, and when his body was finally washed ashore, it was burned on the beach by Byron and his friends. Mary eventually made her way back to London, where she supported herself by her writing. Biographies, travelogues, short stories, as well as novels. She died from a brain tumour in 1851 at the age of 53. But Frankenstein lives on. There have been countless adaptations for stage and screen, and the very name Frankenstein has been synonymous with public anxiety about scientific research. It's become a sort of creation myth for the age of genetic engineering. So I am excited about the possibility of a Frankenstein museum in Bath, and I hope that's another reason for you to come back to Bath at some stage in the future.